Okay, stop scrolling. I need 1 minute. Not a gross video, not a cringe video. This is history, real history, wild history. Here's the thing, half of every human who ever lived has had a period for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet, look at history books, pages on Roman roads, pages on ancient wars, almost nothing on this. That's weird. That's a gap. Tonight we fix it. Egypt, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, China, Japan, the Aztecs, Native America. We go everywhere. We find out what women used, what they believed, and some of the wildest things men wrote about this topic in history. Some of it is smart, some of it is disgusting, some of it will genuinely make you say, wait, what? And one civilization used a method so clever, modern scientists actually went back and studied why it worked. Buckle up. This gets weird fast. Let's start simple. Did ancient people even understand periods? Not really. Many cultures didn't see it as biology. They saw it as a force, sometimes sacred, sometimes scary, sometimes both at once. And that belief shaped everything. It decided how women lived, how they moved, what they could touch, where they could go, even what they were allowed to eat some months. No pressure, ladies. So before pads, before herbs, before rituals, we need this backdrop because the tools were never just hygiene. They were survival, sometimes literal survival. Let's start in Egypt because Egypt was ahead of everyone as usual. We have real medical records here. The Papyrus papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts on Earth, over 3,000 years old. It mentions gynecological health directly, not vaguely. Directly. Translation? Egyptians weren't hiding this. They studied it. They wrote it down like doctors. So what did they actually use? Most historians believe softened papyrus, rolled up, shaped like a pad. Makes sense. Papyrus was cheap, soft once processed, basically the ancient version of having supplies in every kitchen cabinet. Some evidence points to linen too. Same fabric used in mummification, same fabric used for clothing. Reusable, washable, practical, very on-brand for a civilization that also invented calendars and dental filling. And here's a detail that always surprises people. Egyptian medical texts mention herbal treatments for cramp, ginger, juniper, early anti-inflammatories basically. 4,000 years before ibuprofen, Egyptian women were out here self-medicating with plants. But here's the real twist. In Egypt, periods weren't shameful. They were linked to fertility, to the goddess Isis, to the same cycle as the Nile flooding, the exact event that built Egyptian civilization in the first place. Coincidence? The Egyptians didn't think so. Women weren't isolated, weren't feared. Life just continued. Work continued. Temple visits continued. Even public life continued more or less like any other week, which, compared to what we're about to cover, is genuinely remarkable. Now compare that to what's coming next, and Egypt starts looking like the surprise hero of this whole story. Ancient Greece, birthplace of democracy, philosophy, math, and also some spectacularly wrong ideas about women's body. Let's talk about Aristotle, one of history's most respected minds. And his theory here? A complete mess. He believed menstrual blood was failed semen, that women tried to make semen too, but failed because they were colder and weaker than men. So blood came out instead. Let that sink in. This wasn't a fringe idea. This was mainstream belief for centuries. Real doctors taught this. Real philosophers repeated it. And it became the excuse for calling women biologically inferior. Convenient, right? But away from the philosophy scrolls, real women were doing something else entirely. Most likely using wool, soft, absorbed, everywhere in a sheep farming society. Historians believe women shaped wool into small, absorbent plugs. Early tampons, essentially. The earliest version of an idea that's still around today. Paired with cloth belts worn around the hips to hold everything in place. Not glamorous, very functional. There's also evidence of belts and loincloth, fabric worn tightly around the hips that could hold absorbent material in place. Not comfortable, probably, but functional, and functional was the entire goal. And here's a detail that rarely makes it into the history book. Some Greek women reportedly avoided public spaces entirely during their period, not for hygiene reasons, for superstition. Some believed a menstruating woman's gaze alone could dull a mirror, or spoil wine. Spoil wine with eye contact. You genuinely could not make this up. And here's the contradiction that makes Greece fascinating. Hippocrates himself called periods a normal, healthy process, connected to overall health. Meanwhile, Aristotle is over here confidently saying, women are basically broken men. Same civilization, same era. Two completely different planets of thought. Now let's go to Rome, home of aqueducts, concrete, complex law, and Pliny the Elder. Pliny is basically the ancient world's version of that one guy at a party with a confident opinion on everything, mostly wrong. He wrote a massive 37-volume encyclopedia on nature, and his section on periods reads like straight-up fantasy fiction. According to Pliny, menstrual blood could kill crops. Dull blades, sour wine, drive dogs mad, rust metal, blacken bronze, and somehow also repel hailstorm. Repel hailstorm. That one's almost impressive. Women weren't just inconvenient in Pliny's world. Apparently they controlled weather patterns. Obviously, real Roman women didn't believe they were personally causing agricultural disaster. Life continued, markets, temple, family, raising kids, normal stuff. Roman women likely used cloth, wool, and sea sponges, widely available across the Mediterranean, naturally soft, naturally absorbent, and reusable after washing. There's even a debated ancient text from the poet Ausonius referencing a sponge used in what some historians interpret as a menstrual context, the kind of tiny indirect clue historians love to argue about for decades, which usually means it's real. And just like everywhere else, wealth mattered enormously. Rich women had fine linen and servants to wash and prepare it. Poor women, and most women were poor, had rough cloth and whatever was available. This wealth gap shows up in literally every civilization we're about to cover. It's ancient, and it's consistent. And honestly, Pliny wasn't even done. He also claimed a menstruating woman's touch could cause fruit to fall from trees and mirrors to lose their shine, just by walking past, not touching, walking past. Imagine being blamed for a broken mirror because you existed in the same room as it. You ever have a bad day and think, this can't get worse? Try being blamed for ruining someone's crops, curdling their milk, and dulling their sword all before lunch. Rome, ladies and gentlemen, home of advanced engineering and extremely creative nonsense. Now let's pause the timeline for a second, because something bigger runs through almost every culture on this list: taboo. In ancient Jewish law, a menstruating woman was considered ritually impure, called nida, restricted from touch, restricted from certain objects, required a ritual purification bath before returning to normal life. In Hindu tradition, ancient legal texts warned that a man who had contact with a menstruating woman could lose his strength, his wisdom, even his long life. Dramatic, but extremely effective at enforcing distance. Zoroastrian tradition went even further. Menstruating women were isolated, given limited food, and kept away from fire, water, and earth, the sacred elements themselves. And across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, many indigenous cultures used moon lodges, separate spaces, used temporarily, once a month, sometimes framed as impurity, but often the opposite, a time of heightened spiritual power, not punishment. Here's the key part though. None of these restrictions came with better tools. Being isolated in a hut didn't mean better materials magically appeared. It meant working with whatever tradition and geography provided. Cloth, soft leaves, plant fiber, whatever worked. Now, medieval Europe. And look, the bad hygiene reputation this era has, in this specific case, kind of earned. For most medieval women, peasants, laborers, anyone without money, free bleeding was likely the daily reality. Thick wool skirts and dark fabric absorbed and hid the flow while women kept working. Stopping wasn't a luxury they had. Wealthier women used folded linen or wool, held in place with a belt or girdle, washed, reused, not that different mechanically from methods used in some parts of the world even today. But the medical thinking here is genuinely bizarre. European medicine, inherited from Greece and Rome, distorted through the church, believed periods were the body purging excess blood, a kind of natural cleansing, so doctors actually encouraged bleeding. If a period was late, physicians prescribed herbs specifically to trigger it. There was an entire category of plants called emmenagogue: parsley, pennyroyal, tansy, wormwood. And here's the twist. Some of these plants genuinely do stimulate uterine contraction, which means herbal medicine, period regulation, and early contraception were tangled together in ways historians are still untangling today. And it gets darker. In some medieval communities, unusual or heavy bleeding was occasionally treated with suspicion, tangled up with the era's obsession with witchcraft and sin. A woman's body, quite literally, could be used as evidence against her. Imagine explaining a heavy flow to a room full of men who think you might be cursed. Rough era to bleed in, honestly. Let's take a quick detour to ancient India, because this one flips the whole taboo narrative on its head. Ancient Ayurvedic texts describe menstruation not as dirty or dangerous, but as a natural cycle tied to balance in the body, a biological event, not a curse. Women reportedly used old cloth, folded and washed repeatedly, similar to what we'd now call a reusable cloth pad. Sustainable, practical. Honestly, kind of ahead of its time. Some communities also practiced a kind of scheduled rest. Women stepping back from cooking duties or temple visits during this time each month. Today we'd call that self-care. Back then it was just tradition. Same action. Completely different reputation depending on who's telling the story. Funny how that works. Speaking of advanced medicine, let's head to China. Traditional Chinese medicine treated the female body completely differently than Greece or Rome ever did. Not a broken version of men. Its own complete system. Periods weren't shameful here. They were diagnostic. The timing, color, and consistency of blood were used by physicians over 2,000 years ago, going back to the Han Dynasty, to detect imbalances in the body. Things like blood stagnation or cold in the uterus. Practically, women used cloth pads made from silk or cotton depending on social class. Silk for the wealthy, cotton for everyone else. Held in place by woven belts tied around the waist, a design not entirely unlike a modern reusable pad holder. By the Tang Dynasty, roughly 600 to 900 CE, there's evidence of even more advanced undergarment design, including built-in fabric pouches for holding absorbent material, functionally the direct ancestors of modern reusable pads. China also had a strong tradition of herbal formulas, some of which are still used today, specifically designed to regulate cycles and manage cramp. Not folklore, documented, refined, passed down through actual medical lineages. Compare that to European superstition happening around the same century. Same biological event, two completely different worldviews. One side treated it as a diagnostic tool for whole-body health. The other side treated it as a moral hazard that needed managing before it caused disaster. Same body, same blood. Wildly different conclusion. Now let's jump to Japan, because this one genuinely surprises people. Historical records suggest Japanese women used thick, layered paper, sometimes combined with cloth, held in place with a fundoshi-style undergarment, basically an early pad and belt system. Some accounts mention paper stuffed with soft material for extra absorption. Imagine your period supplies being handmade like origami. Stressful? Maybe. Resourceful? Absolutely. Now, let's cross an ocean, because this next part of history is frustratingly incomplete. Not because it didn't happen, because colonization erased so much of the written and oral record. In the Aztec world, everything ran on cycle. Agriculture, warfare, time itself. The female body fit naturally into that world. It wasn't excluded, it was part of the pattern. Historians believe Aztec women used fibers from the maguey plant, the same plant that also gave Mesoamerican culture food, rope, and early alcohol, as absorbent material. Versatile plant. Versatile use. Across many North American indigenous traditions, women in moon lodges followed specific customs, certain foods, certain herbs, certain rituals of their own. Far from being punished, many were considered at their most spiritually powerful during this time. The moon lodge wasn't a prison. In several traditions, it worked more like a monthly retreat. Women returned from it with renewed status, having completed another cycle. And here's something worth citing. Native American communities across different regions also used sphagnum moss for absorption. Modern science later confirmed this moss actually has natural antimicrobial properties. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't know what bacteria was. But generations of trial and error led them to a genuinely science-backed solution, centuries before anyone could explain why it worked. That's not luck. That's applied science before science had a name. Now here's a fun fact that tends to genuinely shock people. The modern disposable pad wasn't invented until the late 19th century, and even then it took decades before most women could actually access. The first commercially produced disposable pad appeared around 1888, a product from Johnson & Johnson. It flopped. Victorian women were far too embarrassed to buy it from a male pharmacist over the counter. The product quietly failed. It wasn't until 1921, when a new advertising campaign rebranded menstrual products as basic hygiene rather than an embarrassing item, that mass adoption finally began. Think about that timeline for a second. Egypt figured out papyrus rolls 3,000 years ago. Rome had wool-wrapped applicators 2,000 years ago. And it took until the 1920s for the Western world to just say the word hygiene in an advertisement without flinching. Progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a very long, very awkward detour. There's also a wilder origin story hiding in here. During World War I, nurses discovered that cellulose bandage material, originally made for wound dressing, was incredibly absorbent, more absorbent than cloth, and disposable. Nurses started repurposing surgical bandages for their own periods. That accidental discovery became the direct ancestor of the modern disposable pad. Let that sink in. The pad you can buy at a gas station exists because of battlefield medicine, not marketing. Then in the 1930s, the modern tampon was patented, refining a concept that traced back all the way to ancient Rome's wool-wrapped applicators. 2,000 years of trial and error, finally leading to cardboard. History has jokes. Let that sink in for a second. For the vast majority of human history, including every single civilization we just walked through, women were managing their periods with cloth, wool, sponges, leaves, plant fiber, paper, and papyrus, and doing so effectively enough to live full, active lives. The modern pad is barely 100 years old. It's a blink in historical time. Okay, we've gone from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe to Japan to the Aztecs to World War I. Let's take a breath and think about what all of this actually means. First, women were never passive victims of their own biology. Across every civilization, women developed practical, often genuinely sophisticated solutions to a universal physical reality. They used what they had. They refined it across generations. They shared it through oral tradition, medical texts, and simple community practice. Second, the biggest obstacle was never really material. Wool existed everywhere. Cloth existed everywhere. Sponges existed around the Mediterranean. Paper existed in Japan. The problem was rarely access to materials. The problem was always the culture wrapped around it. When a society decided periods were dangerous or shameful, it restricted women's movement, labor, and freedom. When a society decided it was simply biological or even sacred, women continued their lives with barely any disruption at all. The material solutions were often nearly identical. The cultural consequences were radically different. Third, men wrote most of the historical record, and they wrote it from the outside. Pliny's absurd list of things menstrual blood could supposedly destroy tells us nothing about what Roman women actually experienced. It tells us what Roman men feared and misunderstood. The actual knowledge, the practical, generational, embodied knowledge of what genuinely worked, lived inside communities of women. And it was almost never written down. That's a real loss, a genuine historical loss we're still piecing back together. One papyrus scrap and one footnote at a time. And here's the part that might genuinely surprise you. This isn't all ancient history. In parts of Nepal, a practice called chowpatty, where menstruating women and girls are sent to sleep in separate huts away from the main house, persisted well into the 21st century. It's now illegal there, but laws don't erase centuries of tradition overnight. So this isn't just a story about the past. It's a story that's still being written in some places right now. One more thing before we close. We've talked about pads and cloth and moss and sponges. We haven't really talked about pain, because cramps are real, physiological, and they've always existed. This was never a modern invention. Ancient medical texts across every single culture we covered mention painful periods and attempts to treat them. Greeks used warm compresses and herbal infusion. Roman physicians prescribed exercise. Chinese medicine had elaborate herbal formula. Medieval Europeans had their plant-based remedy. And, almost universally, the herbs that show up across these traditions have one thing in common. Many of them actually work. Ginger, cinnamon, fennel, chamomile, not random folklore. Accumulated empirical knowledge, tested across generations of women trying things and quietly reporting back. Think about what that actually required. No clinical trials, no lab equipment, no peer review, just generations of careful, repeated observation passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece, healer to apprentice. A knowledge system built entirely on attention and memory, and it still landed on plants modern pharmacology recognizes today. That's not primitive. That's just science without the paperwork. The irony is enormous. For all the nonsense men wrote about this, Aristotle's failed semen theory, Pliny's crop-killing superpowers, entire religious systems built on impurity law, the actual practical medical knowledge women passed down was often genuinely sophisticated. Women figured it out because women had to. We have entire museums dedicated to ancient weapons. We reconstruct ancient battle formations down to the smallest detail. We make documentary after documentary about emperors, generals, and kings. But the daily experience of half the population, the practical, intimate, universal reality of menstruation barely shows up anywhere. Not in the documentaries, not in school curricula, barely even in academic literature until fairly recently. And honestly, the fact that we probably needed a slightly provocative question just to get you to click on this video says a lot about how we've been trained to look at the past and what we've quietly decided is worth remembering. And yet this is one of the most universal human experiences that has ever existed. Every generation in every civilization on every continent dealt with this. They found solutions. They built knowledge. They passed it down quietly for thousands of years. That's history. That's actually fascinating history. So next time this topic comes up and someone acts like it's somehow taboo or inappropriate to talk about, remind them. Egyptian priestesses dealt with this. Roman women dealt with this. Medieval peasants dealt with this. Aztec women dealt with this. Japanese women, Chinese women, Indian women, Native American women, all of them dealt with it. And remind yourself too, next time you grab something off a shelf without a second thought, that box in your bathroom cabinet, it's not just a product. It's the final chapter of a 4,000-year-old story. A story of papyrus and wool, of moss and silk, of superstition sitting right next to genuine science. of shame in one century and quiet brilliance in the next. This isn't some awkward modern topic. It's ancient history, and it's about time we started treating it that way.